Hey you guys, AJ here. Welcome back to my channel. Hope you're doing good. In our previous video, we made the character equip these items from the inventory. We also made the character switch items, and when the player picks up a new item, the old item he was equipped with goes back to the inventory. Now, in this video, we are gonna see how we can override the animation that we already have on a player and add some new animations to go with when the player is equipped with a weapon like a sword or a shield and so on. So without further ado, let's get started. So guys, first thing we are going to do is, if you remember in the fighter script, we already uh, had set up a plan animator which just gets the animator which is on the game object, and we can use this and override this from the equipment manager when the player equips a weapon. So what we are going to do here is we are just going to make this a public field instead of a private one. And if you haven't watched my video on setting up fighter script, you can go check that out. I will put a link to that in the description down below. And then we are gonna go to the equipment script. Here we are gonna need a field animator override controller so that we can override the animation using that animator override controller. So I'm just gonna make a public field. It's gonna be of type animator override controller. Call this. Let's just call this override controller and set it to null. And here in the equipment manager script, we are gonna create an instance of a fighter. So fighter, fighter, and in start we are just gonna say fighter equal to get component fighter, and this is gonna be get component and not get component parent, because all the characters have got a fighter script of their own, because the attacks, damages and everything should be kind of different, I guess. Now we can come down here in the equip item method, and after we have instantiated the weapon on the player's hands, we can create a variable, and let's just call this override controller. And this is just to save the initial or the default animation which was on the player before he equipped any weapon. So here we are going to use fighter dot player animator dot runtime animator controller and set it as a animator override controller. Then put it in our override controller. Now here we are going to have a check if current equipment on slot 2 has an animator override controller. So if we go here, we just called it override controller. So override controller. So if that is not equal to null, and that's because all the equipment doesn't really need a override controller. Like if you have a health potion or something, you don't need a override controller. And uh, same with the case of a hat or a armor, any kind of armor doesn't need any override controller. We are just gonna have our right controller on weapons, because we are not going to be using the same animations like punching or kicking when we have a sword on our hand. And we are just going to check if we have an equipment on the second slot, and we're using the second slot because in the equipment script, in the equipment slot, we have hands as the second slot, 0, 1 and 2. And usually hands are the place where you put a weapon on, and we're just going to have override controller for weapons, like I said. If that is not equal to null, then we are going to say fighter dot player animator dot runtime override override controller equals this one. Now back in Unity, I'm gonna go uh, here in the animators folder, create, and here I'm gonna select animator override controller. Uh, let's call this sword and shield animator override controller, and the controller is gonna be the third person animator controller, which is the animator controller we animator which we have on the on all the players kind of. So here I'm just gonna change the inside crescent, which is the animation which we get when we press this button. I'm gonna change that, and these are all the animations which are on the player. And I'm gonna say use the sword and shield slash, which is an animation I just picked up from Mixamo. You can go there and pick it up, and it's free to be used on anything that you're working on. So yeah, now in the resources, default equipments is a folder I created, and we'll look to that in a bit. But before that, in the items and equipments folder, we got the blade and shield, and now we got the override controller here. So for this, I'm just gonna add the sword and shield override controller. Now let's hit play, try to equip some items, and see if the animation is changing when the player picks up a sword and a shield combo item. So when we start the game, the animation on the player is this, but when we go, let's say pick this item up, hope it's a sword, yeah, and it is. So if we pick this up, and now if we press this button, we are gonna get the new animation going on. So that's cool. Now we just have a problem. We don't have a method to return back to the old animation, because we don't have a option of unequipping the player totally of all the weapons. We can of course switch weapons, but we still don't have a option of making the player um, unequipped once he has equipped a weapon. So let's try to do that now. So what I'm going to do is go to the UI panel, game UI, and where we have all the buttons, inventory button. After that, I'm just going to duplicate this and call this unequipped weapon. Let's kind of position this on the screen. So I'm just going to switch to 2D. Let's say -1 on pivot X, and let's say -1.2. That should be fine. Now we are going to need to decrease the size of the fixed touch field a bit so that they don't overlap. And let's kind of change the image on this. So I don't have a image for that or a sprite for that yet. So I'm just gonna use this knob for now. Now let's get back to Visual Studios. Now here in the fixed button assigner script, we are gonna need to add a new button in the list, and let's just copy this, and fixed button assigner is a script just to assign the buttons on the screen. Like we got all the buttons here, kind of like jump, crouch, logout button, attack, 1, 2 and 3, inventory button, all those. And if you have watched my
previous videos on fixed button assigner, you will kind of understand. If you don't, I suggest you please go back and check that out, or put a link to that as well in the description below. So here we are going to just change the fixed button list, and the position is going to be 7. Here the name is going to be unequip button, and here we are going to need to change the size of the fixed button list to 8. Now we can go to equipment manager. Here we are going to need a instance of fixed button assigner and a fixed button assigner. I'm just going to call it as FBA, and let's set this in. Start FBA is equal to get component fixed button assigner. Now let's have a fixed button, or let's just make it a serialized field so that we can see it in Unity editor. And let's call this an equip button. And in the equipment manager, let's add an update method. Here we're going to check if the unequip button, I'm just going to rename it to have a smaller case u, and if this is equal to null, then we can go ahead and assign it from a fixed button assigner. So unequip button equal to fixed button assigner FBA dot get fixed buttons, and fixed buttons is gonna return the list of all the buttons, and we just need the 7th element of that array. So if you check the fixed button assigner script, the get fixed button is gonna return an array of all the buttons in here, and we have the unequip button at the 7th element, so that's why we use 7 here. So guys, when I said we are gonna unequip the item, I was kind of lying, because we are not gonna unequip the weapon completely. What we are gonna do is we are gonna have a default weapon on the player's hand always when the game begins also, and then we are gonna switch it with a weapon when we equip a weapon. The default weapon is of course gonna be a empty game object, uh, and we are gonna have a field here of type equipment, and it's gonna be of serialized field because we wanna be able to edit it from the Unity editor. Let's just call this default equipment, and here in the equip method, before we send the item or old item back to the inventory, we are gonna check if the old item is gonna be our default item. So if default equipment, sorry, if old item dot display name get display name equals default, then we don't wanna send it back to the inventory. So here it's gonna be not equal to default item, then we send it back to the inventory. Else we don't do that. So we're gonna need to create a new scriptable object, same as we make any other weapon. So let's say we go back to Unity, and this is what the default equipments folder was for. So here we are just going to create a scriptable object, just as any of these scriptable objects we have here. So create project inventory equipment, and let's call this default equipment, and equipment slot is going to be hands. The display name is going to be default, and you can give it any name. Actually, you just need to make sure that when you have the check condition here, you use the same name. The pickup is gonna be this. We don't need an icon, I think, but we'll see if we get any error in the future. So the equip prefab one, that is just gonna be a empty game object. Let's make a empty game object, call this equipped empty, and in the prefabs equip weapons, I'm just gonna make a prefab of this. We can say go here, equipped empty is going to be the equip prefab one, and we don't really need an equip prefab 2, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Now let's go to the animators character. Here we have the player animator controller for each of the characters I have. In case you don't have player selection in your game, you just gotta do this create animator override controller, just like we did for the sword and shield animation, and create a default player animator controller, and you can use that. So here in the default empty equipment, I'm just gonna say override controller is gonna be of player 12 animator override controller, because that's the character I'm using for this video. And let's just give it a description like empty equipment, and cool. Now if we go back to the equipment manager, we can just use the equip method to equip this default equipment in start, and then it's gonna come here, check if there's an old item, because there isn't an old item in that slot. It's just gonna set this default equipment to the current equipment slot. And since we have the same animations as in the fighters player animator controller on the animator override controller on the default equipment, it's gonna play the same animations. Now when we equip a new item, we are just gonna switch the default equipment with the new weapon, and if the player presses the unequip button, we are just gonna switch the weapon back with the default equipment. So let's create a method for that, for unequipping the weapons, and we can kind of use the same for unequipping armor as well. So let's say void unequip, and let's have a slot index here. So slot index is going to be passed down to this method. Here we are going to check if current equipment of slot index is not null, and if it is not null, we are just going to go ahead and call equip, pass down the default equipment, and that's about it for unequipping the weapon. So we just need to call it here when we let's say press input dot get key down, press a button, let's say U, or if unequip button is pressed, then we just go ahead and call uh, unequip, And in this case, we are just going to be working on weapons for like today. So we are just going to pass in 2 here because weapons go in hands and handles the second slot and equipment slot as we said before. So now let's go check this out if this is working in Unity. So guys, slight error here. We kind of named the unequip button as unequip weapon. So let's just rename that here. And here in the fixed button list, we are going to need to change the size to 8 because we added a new element. And we're going to need to drag and drop the default equipment onto the default equipment slot in the equipment manager. Now, if we go ahead and start.
Guys, if you see the unequip button field here, you can see that it is kind of equipped itself with the button from the fixed button assigner. So that's cool. And now let's just maximize this. And all other animations are working fine when the player is not equipping any weapon. Now let's go pick this up, go to inventory, equip this. Now we are gonna have the animation switch to the one where we have a sword and a shield. And yeah, that's working fine as well. Now guys, if we click on the unequip button, we are going to see that the player is going to return the items back to the inventory and the animation is going to go back to normal. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, that is it for today's video. Thank you for watching. I hope you like this video on how to unequip the player, how to override the animation on the player with new animations when a player equips different weapons. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and go ahead and subscribe to my channel. That would be really helpful. Until next time, see you. Bye.